A young child vanishes into the darkness, leaving only a dropped snack and a solitary cigarette near an abandoned coal mine. The investigation froze for 2 decades, paralyzing a rural village with absolute fear. What unseen phantom slipped into the shadows, and will the ultimate truth ever surface? Please like and subscribe to join us on this case. This video contains chilling secrets. Viewer discretion is advised. In the world of criminal investigation, the instinct and logical reasoning of seasoned detectives are the foundational pillars of solving any case. However, human intuition alone is not always enough to unravel the darkest and most complex of mysteries. History is littered with cases that have stumped even the most brilliant minds, hitting dead ends that seem impossible to overcome. In these moments of despair, biological investigative technology steps into the spotlight. Tools like fingerprint analysis and genetic sequencing have revolutionized the field, turning microscopic traces into glaring signposts pointing straight to a killer. The case we are examining today perfectly illustrates this reality. Without the intervention of advanced forensic science, this horrific crime might have remained buried forever in the dusty archives of cold cases, and a ruthless predator would have successfully slipped through the fingers of justice. Our story takes us to Maqiao, a small village nestled in the jurisdiction of Liu Town, located within Xinjiang City in Henan province. Situated roughly 3.6 miles southeast of the urban center of Xinjiang, Maqiao was a place caught in the chaotic throes of transition. In recent years, infrastructure development had slowly begun to change the rugged face of this hilly region. Paved roads had finally snaked their way to the village outskirts, making travel slightly more bearable for the locals. Because of its proximity to the newly constructed highway, the homes in Maqiao Village were scattered loosely along the main road, stretching north to south for about 2 to 2.5 miles. Beginning in 1993, Maqiao experienced a brief but intense economic boom centered around coal mining. Xinjiang City was rich in coal resources, and the promise of steady wages drew migrant workers from all corners of the country. This influx of transient laborers, often referred to as a blind flow migration, where workers moved from rural areas to industrial zones without formal residency or contracts, breathed a chaotic life into the once quiet village. The coal seams beneath Maqiao were not particularly thick, but the lure of profit led to the excavation of numerous makeshift mining caves carved directly into the hillsides. However, the boom was short-lived. By 1996, the mining operations began to dwindle, and the dark, gaping maws of the coal shafts were gradually abandoned, left to rot like open wounds in the earth. On the evening of November 26, 1996, the usual quiet of Maqiao Village was shattered. It was 7 o'clock in the evening, and the crisp autumn air was pierced by frantic voices. The rhythmic crunch of hurried footsteps and desperate shouts echoed through the darkness, accompanied by the sweeping beams of flashlights and the flickering glow of handheld torches. The villagers were searching for Xiao Guo. Xiao Guo was an 8-year-old girl from the Zhang family. With her parents away running a business in the distant city of Chengzhou, she lived at home with her grandmother. The Zhang family had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, and Xiao Guo was the youngest. She was described by everyone as an incredibly sweet child with an infectious smile, known for her excellent academic performance and gentle nature. She was what many in China refer to as a left-behind child, a common social phenomenon where parents migrate to urban centers for work, leaving their offspring in the care of elderly relatives in rural villages. The panic had set in when her grandmother realized Xiao Guo had never come home from school. As the afternoon shadows stretched into twilight and the evening meal grew cold, the grandmother's worry blossomed into sheer terror. She reached out to her neighbors, begging for their help. Understanding the gravity of the situation, several villagers quickly rallied together and a few immediately headed out to notify the local police, praying that official intervention would swiftly bring the little girl home. By 7:30 in the evening, officers from the local police station had arrived in Maqiao to assist the frantic community. The search party combed through every conceivable location. They scoured the paths Xiao Guo might have taken, trekked along the edges of the highway, waded through the damp rice paddies, circled the dark ponds, and even ventured near the perilous, abandoned coal mines. But the night yielded nothing. The darkness seemed to have swallowed the 8-year-old girl whole. With heavy hearts and exhausted bodies, the villagers could do nothing more but offer hollow words of comfort to Xiao Guo's devastated grandmother before returning to their homes as the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn. At 6:40 in the morning on November 27th, Xiao Guo's father, Zhang Shenji, arrived back in the village. He had traveled through the night from Chengzhou after receiving a hysterical phone call from his mother the previous evening. By this time, the reality of the working day had pulled most of the villagers back to their routines. The massive search party had dwindled down to Zhang Shenji, a handful of young men from the village, and 2 local police officers. Realizing that blindly wandering the hills was yielding no results, the investigators decided to pivot their strategy. They headed straight to Xiao Guo's school to trace her last known steps and question anyone who might have seen her the previous afternoon. The timeline, however, was frustratingly broken. The trail went cold right after she left the school gates at noon on November 26th. Investigators spoke with 4 children who had walked part of the way home with Xiao Guo that fateful afternoon. According to their innocent testimonies, the group of 5 friends had been chatting and laughing as they left the school grounds. Xiao Guo had even pulled a packet of dry instant noodles, a popular and cheap snack for children, from her leather backpack to munch on as they walked. But children are easily distracted. Caught up in their own jokes and games, the friends suddenly realized that Xiao Guo was no longer walking beside them. Assuming she was just playing a game of hide-and-seek, the children cheerfully scattered to look for her. Xiao Ling, a bright and observant 9-year-old girl in the group, took the initiative to ask an adult for help. She approached a woman by the side of the road and asked if she had seen a little girl pass by. The woman pointed toward a steep slope leading up to one of the abandoned coal mines, not too far from the main path. Standing at the bottom of the slope and looking up at the dark, intimidating entrance of the old mine, Xiao Ling felt a shiver of fear. She called out to her friends to join her. When the older children bravely climbed to the top of the slope and peered around the abandoned site, they saw absolutely no sign of Xiao Guo. With the naive logic of youth, the children concluded that Xiao Guo must have gotten bored and simply run all the way home ahead of them. Dismissing the event from their minds, the friends parted ways and headed to their respective houses. Back at the Zhang household, the grandmother had been operating under a tragic misunderstanding. When Xiao Guo failed to return at lunch, the elderly woman simply assumed the school had scheduled an unexpected afternoon session, or that her granddaughter had stayed behind to study in the library. It was not until the evening, when the older grandchild returned from school and confirmed that all the neighborhood children were already home, that the dreadful reality crashed down upon her. She had rushed to the neighbors, hoping Xiao Guo was just visiting, but was met with confused headshakes. The final blow came when one of the children from the walking group casually mentioned that their class did not even have afternoon sessions that day. That was the exact moment the grandmother knew Xiao Guo was missing, prompting the frantic phone call to her son in Changzhou and the desperate midnight search. It was now 5 o'clock in the afternoon on November 27th. The police had pieced together the fragments of information provided by the villagers and the children. All signs pointed to one final, terrifying location: the slope leading to the abandoned coal mine. This particular mine had been out of operation for years, sitting in desolate isolation far from the daily foot traffic of the village. As the investigative team, now bolstered by more volunteers, approached the site, the evening sky was once again turning a bruised, dusky purple. They fanned out, Checking the perimeter of the cavernous opening, Officer Chen, gripping a heavy-duty flashlight, stepped cautiously toward the gaping mouth of the abandoned shaft. He swept the harsh white beam across the jagged walls and the debris-littered floor. Then, the light caught something unnatural in the suffocating darkness. "Over here! Come quick! I found her!" The officer's voice cracked, echoing chillingly against the stone walls. The shout drew the rest of the search party toward the cave entrance like a magnet. There, lying in the dirt, was the lifeless body of Xiao Guo. The scene was a vision of absolute heartbreak and depravity. The little girl's body was partially exposed. She was completely naked from the waist down, her delicate frame hurriedly covered with mounds of loose dirt, as if the killer had tried to erase his monstrous deed by burying her right there on the cave floor. Zheng Shenji, pushing through the crowd, saw the tiny, dirt-covered figure and let out a wail that tore through the quiet evening. Trembling violently, he lunged forward, desperate to take his baby girl into his arms. But the officers, trained to preserve the integrity of a crime scene, immediately intercepted him. They held the grieving father back, their own faces tight with sorrow, and quickly ordered the young villagers to help them secure a wide perimeter around the cave. Simultaneously, an urgent call was radioed to the Xinmi City Police Department, requesting immediate backup and a specialized forensic team. The forensic pathologist from the Xinmi City Public Security Bureau arrived shortly after. The crime scene was an abandoned coal excavation site located roughly 1 mile from the southernmost tip of Maqiao Village. Inside the cave, rotting wooden support beams and rusted, unusable mining tools lay scattered, left behind by the transient workers years ago. Xiao Guo's body was discovered approximately 16 feet inside the cave entrance. The initial observations made by the local officers were tragically accurate. Her lower half had been stripped bare. The little skirt she had worn to school that morning was found discarded roughly 6.5 feet away, tossed carelessly next to her small leather backpack. The preliminary autopsy, conducted under the stark glare of portable halogen lights, revealed a grim narrative of her final moments. The cause of death was determined to be mechanical asphyxiation. Deep, purple contusions on her upper arms indicated that she had been violently restrained, fighting back desperately against a significantly stronger assailant. The pathologists also documented severe trauma to her back and shoulder blades, suggesting the killer had ruthlessly pinned her against the unforgiving, rocky ground. Most horrifying of all was the brutal nature of the sexual assault. The trauma to her lower anatomy was catastrophic, adding an extra layer of cruelty to the already monstrous act. The killer's frantic attempt to conceal the body with soil meant that dirt had been forced into her mouth and deeply into her wounds. An 8-year-old child had met an end so violent and terrifying that it left even the hardened detectives shaken to their core. But the forensic team found something else. Deep within the darkest shadows of this tragedy, a microscopic ray of hope emerged. The pathologists successfully recovered a trace amount of seminal fluid from the victim. Working meticulously, they extracted the biological sample. In 1996, DNA profiling was still a developing technology in many regions, but the detectives knew this sample was the golden key. It was carefully preserved, a silent witness waiting for the day science could give it a voice. To crack this horrific case, the police cast a massive investigative net. Their first step was to gather every shred of intelligence from the Maqiao Village local council. Next, officers went door to door, speaking with every household in the vicinity. Finally, they organized 3 mandatory village meetings to canvass for any overlooked details. The demographic makeup of Maqiao complicated matters immensely. The village was not just a tight-knit community of locals, it was a transient hub. Hundreds of migrant laborers lived in the area, meaning the suspect pool extended far beyond the familiar faces of the villagers. Detectives from Xinmi City first interviewed the Zhang family to reconstruct Xiao Guo's routine and explore any potential motives of revenge. Was it possible that someone harbored a grudge against the family and used the child to exact a devastating toll? According to Liu Shenzhang, the answer was a resolute no. After the birth of their first 3 children, he and his wife had relocated to Changzhou to secure better work. When Xiao Guo was born, the financial strain of raising 4 children in the city proved too much. They made the difficult choice to send the 2 youngest back to Maqiao to be raised by their grandmother. The parents only returned for major holidays like the Lunar New Year or during the summer school break. They were quiet, hard-working people who rarely interacted with the broader village politics, let alone engaged in bitter feuds. Furthermore, the Zhang family's immediate neighbors had known them for decades. There was no history of property disputes, unpaid debts, or scandalous affairs. It seemed entirely implausible that this was a targeted revenge killing. Despite this, investigators firmly believe the killer had to be someone familiar with the area, if not the family itself. The children's testimony was crucial. Xiao Guo had willingly walked toward the slope, leading to the abandoned mine. This behavioral clue led to a working theory. The killer might have been an acquaintance who had lured her under false pretenses, or someone she recognized who called out to her from the path. However, the sheer brutality of the crime challenged this theory. If this was a calculated act of revenge by an acquaintance, why the horrific sexual assault? The psychological profile pointed not to a vengeful neighbor, but to a deeply disturbed, opportunistic sexual predator. The debate raged inside the incident room. Was it a crime of passion, a calculated revenge plot masked as an assault, or a random act of pure evil? The only undisputed fact was the killer's staggering ruthlessness, and while they possessed the biological sample, the local forensic capabilities at the time could not immediately translate that fluid into a suspect's name. Undeterred by the technological limitations, the boots-on-the-ground investigation pressed forward relentlessly. Over 800 migrant workers and 256 local households in Maqiao were subjected to rigorous interrogations. On the 6th day of the massive sweep, a fragile thread of evidence finally appeared. Li Shenzhang, a migrant worker employed at the No. 5 coal mine in Maqiao, came forward with a peculiar observation. He told detectives that on the afternoon of November 25th, the day before the murder, he had spotted 2 men loitering on the dirt path leading up to the abandoned mine shaft. According to Li, the men looked nervous and incredibly suspicious. When they realized they were being watched, they immediately veered off the path, avoiding the cave entirely and hurrying away in a different direction. Based on Li Shenzhang's detailed physical description, investigators quickly identified one of the men. His name was Chen Ren, a 25-year-old migrant laborer working in the village. While their suspicious behavior occurred 24 hours before the murder, the fact that they were skulking around a desolate, abandoned crime scene was a red flag the police could not ignore. Only 2 hours after receiving the suspicious tip from the migrant worker, investigators descended upon the coal mine to confront Chen Ren. Realizing he was under the intense scrutiny of a murder investigation, the 25-year-old migrant worker maintained a surprisingly calm demeanor. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a cigarette, and lit it, taking a long, slow drag before addressing the detectives. He readily admitted that on the afternoon of November 25th, he and a friend named Xu Jianjian had indeed walked past the steep slope leading to the abandoned cave. However, he adamantly denied ever stepping foot inside the dark shaft. According to his statement, the 2 of them were simply utilizing a well-known dirt shortcut to reach a local tavern for an afternoon of drinking. Detectives immediately set out to verify his story. They tracked down Xu Jianjian and the tavern owner, both of whom corroborated Chen Ren's timeline without hesitation. The men had arrived at the tavern that afternoon and stayed until late into the night. More importantly, both men possessed ironclad alibis for November 26th, the actual day the little girl was murdered. The manager of the coal mine provided employment records proving that both Chen Ren and Xu Zhenjiang were on the clock from 7 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening. Their only break was a strict 1-hour lunch period. During that hour, they spent 30 minutes eating in the canteen, surrounded by dozens of their coworkers. This left a mere 30-minute window of unsupervised free time. Given that the bicycle ride from the mine to the crime scene took a full 10 minutes in each direction, it left a maximum of 10 minutes to intercept a child, drag her into a cave, commit a horrific sexual assault, murder her, bury her under heavy soil, and return to work without drawing any suspicion. The logistics of such a timeline were physically impossible. Furthermore, there was absolutely no way they could have predicted Xiao Guo's exact route and timing on that specific afternoon. Consequently, Chen Ren and Xu Zhenjiang were officially cleared of suspicion and removed from the suspect list. Simultaneously, the crime scene unit uncovered 2 crucial pieces of physical evidence that painted a much clearer, albeit darker, picture of the abduction. Investigators discovered a torn, half-empty packet of dry children's instant noodles discarded on the dirt path leading up to the mine, approximately 390 feet from the cave entrance. The brightly colored packaging was fresh, completely untarnished by the damp earth or wind, indicating it had been dropped very recently. Recalling the testimonies of Xiao Guo's schoolmates, detectives confirmed this was the exact brand of snack the little girl had been eating on her way home. The geography of the surrounding area revealed a chilling sequence of events. The route from the local school to the Zhang household was a relatively straight, paved path, measuring just over 1 mile. The slope leading to the abandoned mine lay roughly 1/3 of a mile along this route, branching off sharply to the right side. It was a desolate, overgrown detour that a young, responsible girl had absolutely no reason to take. The dropped noodle packet strongly suggested that Xiao Guo had been violently intercepted while walking on the main path. In her initial shock and frantic struggle against her attacker, she dropped her favorite snack before being forcibly dragged up the steep slope and into the suffocating darkness of the cavern. The second piece of evidence was found just outside the mouth of the cave. It was a freshly discarded, partially smoked cigarette butt. In a remote, rocky area that had been abandoned for years, a fresh cigarette was a glaring anomaly. It was highly probable that the killer had stood there, casually smoking in the shadows, either while lying in wait for a vulnerable victim to pass by, or immediately after committing the unspeakable atrocity to calm his nerves. The forensic laboratory analyzed the chemical composition of the filter and identified it as a specific, somewhat obscure brand manufactured in Anhui province. It was a brand rarely consumed by the local Henan residents due to its strong, harsh flavor. Officer Zhou, one of the lead investigators on the task force, suddenly recalled his earlier interrogation with Chen Ren. The cigarette Chen Ren had so calmly smoked in front of them was the exact same Anhui brand. Despite his ironclad alibi for the exact time of the murder, the physical evidence overwhelmingly pointed back to Chen Ren. He was a native of Anhui province who had moved to the village 8 months prior, and background checks revealed that he actually had a passing acquaintanceship with the Zhang family. Detectives brought him back to the station for a second, highly pressurized round of questioning. Chen Ren stubbornly maintained his innocence, raising his voice and swearing he had never gone near the entrance of the cave. Frustrated but determined to break him, the police brought his companion, Xu Zhenjiang, into a separate interrogation room. Initially, Xu stuck rigidly to his original story, but after a few hours of relentless psychological pressure, a forgotten memory suddenly surfaced. Xu nervously recalled that around 10 o'clock on the night of November 25th, as they were stumbling home completely drunk from the tavern, Chen Ren suddenly needed to relieve himself. Xu had waited on the dirt path while Chen Ren staggered up the slope toward the abandoned mine for some privacy. While urinating in the dark, the heavily intoxicated Chen Ren had lit a cigarette, smoked it halfway, and carelessly tossed it near the cave entrance before returning to his friend. This mundane, drunken act perfectly explained the presence of the ennui cigarette butt at the crime scene. With his alibi for the actual day of the murder holding strong, this new corroborated explanation for the physical evidence meant investigators were legally forced to release him once again. The investigation hit a massive brick wall. The trail had gone completely cold. The killer had seemingly vanished into thin air, leaving no tangible leads, no witnesses, and no obvious motive behind. For the next 2 decades, a heavy, suffocating shroud of fear and paranoia blanketed the village. The horrifying reality that a brutal predator had snatched an innocent child from the primary route to the local school terrified every single parent in the community. Mothers and fathers drastically altered their daily schedules, physically escorting their children to and from the school gates every single day, refusing to let them out of their sight for even a moment. The abandoned coal mines, once viewed as mere industrial eyesores, were now seen as gaping, monstrous traps waiting to swallow another child. Yielding to the desperate, angry petitions of the frightened villagers, the local council eventually hired heavy machinery to permanently seal every single mine shaft in the area with thick concrete and rocks, ensuring no predator could ever use them as a hiding place again. By the year 2000, extensive highway construction and aggressive land leveling projects completely transformed the rugged landscape. The steep slope and the terrifying cave were entirely eradicated, replaced by smooth paved roads and level terrain. The physical crime scene was wiped from the face of the earth, but the psychological trauma remained deeply embedded in the collective memory of the community. A few years later, a strange, violent rumor rippled through the neighboring village of Fengu. A man had aggressively attacked a woman on her way home late at night, but she managed to fight him off fiercely and scream for help. A nearby resident, armed with a heavy hunting rifle, rushed to her aid. In the chaotic, violent struggle that ensued in the dark, the attacker's own weapon accidentally discharged, killing him instantly on the spot. Although local law enforcement authorities never officially linked the two cases, the desperate villagers convinced themselves that this deceased, violent attacker was the very same monster who had murdered Xiao Guo. It was a comforting narrative that finally allowed the community to sleep soundly at night, but the Zhang family never believed it. They knew in their hearts that their daughter's killer was still out there. For years, they haunted the sterile halls of the police station, their overwhelming grief transforming into a desperate, unending plea for justice, only to be met with sympathetic sighs and empty updates from tired detectives. It would take 17 long, agonizing years for the silence to finally break. By the year 2013, the science of genetic profiling had advanced light years beyond the primitive capabilities of the 1990s. Cold case units across the nation were dusting off old forgotten files, praying that modern science could answer old questions. On March 18, 2013, forensic technicians carefully re-examined the biological evidence preserved from the dark, dusty cave. Using new, highly sensitive extraction techniques, they successfully isolated a complete male genetic profile from the seminal fluid recovered from the victim. The microscopic sample was securely transported to the Advanced Biological Laboratory at the Changzhou City Public Security Bureau. Hope flared intensely in the hearts of the aging investigators as the sequence was uploaded into the National Criminal Database. But the result was a devastating, hollow silence. There was no match. The killer was not in the system. The brief, bright spark of hope was brutally extinguished, and the thick case file was once again relegated to the cold storage shelves. But justice, although painfully delayed, is rarely denied entirely. On December 26, 2016, the Senmi City Police Laboratory initiated yet another round of testing using newly acquired, cutting-edge equipment. They managed to isolate an even cleaner, more comprehensive genetic sequence from the original swab. This time, instead of the national system, they ran the profile against a recently updated, highly specific regional database for Henan province. The computer hummed, processed the intricate biological markers, and finally, after 20 long, agonizing years of waiting, the screen flashed green and delivered a name. The genetic sequence was an absolute, undeniable match to a man named Liu Shenzhang. Liu Shenzhang was officially registered as a resident of Maqiao Village, located within Huguang Town in Dancheng County, under the jurisdiction of Xiao Guo City. Armed with a name and a registered address, detectives immediately mobilized a strike team. On January 9, 2017, they located Liu Shenzhang's older brother in the village. The brother, visibly confused by the sudden police presence, revealed a crucial piece of information. Liu Shenzhang had not set foot in their hometown for more than 20 years. He had vanished completely shortly after the time of the murder and was currently working as a manual laborer at the massive Karamay oil fields in the far western desolate province of Xinjiang. The killer had fled across the entire expanse of the country, hiding in the harsh, remote deserts to escape the ghosts of his monstrous past. On March 1st, 2017, exactly 21 years after an innocent 8-year-old girl took her final, terrifying breath in the dirt of a cold cave, the long, patient arm of the law finally caught up with her murderer. Outside residential building number 8 in the Tianyuan community of Jinlong Town, Karamay City, plainclothes officers quietly closed in. When the 43-year-old Liu Shenzhang spotted the approaching detectives, his face drained of color. He did not say a single word. His eyes widened slightly in a flash of terrified recognition. He did not attempt a frantic sprint, but instead tried to quietly and methodically back away, hoping to slip into the surrounding shadows, just as he had successfully done 2 decades prior. But the seasoned officers were much faster. They tackled him forcefully to the concrete pavement, pinning his arms behind his back and securing his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs, finally bringing the elusive fugitive out of the darkness and into the harsh light of justice. 4 days later, on March 5th, forensic analysts conducted a final, irrefutable test to seal his fate. They compared a fresh blood sample drawn directly from Liu Shenzhang against the preserved genetic material of Xiao Guo's parents to establish definitive familial isolation. The laboratory analysis focused specifically on short tandem repeat polymorphisms. The results were absolute. The likelihood ratio calculated by the laboratory was an astronomical figure, recorded as 1.087. In forensic science, a likelihood ratio greater than 1 indicates a mathematical probability of a match, while a number smaller than 1 points to absolute exclusion. This massive, positive figure meant the statistical probability of the killer being anyone other than Liu Shenzhang was essentially 0. The man sitting silently in the interrogation room was definitively the monster from 1996. Inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room of the Shenmi City Public Security Bureau, the heavy silence of 2 decades was finally broken. Liu Shenzhang, now a 43-year-old man hardened by years of manual labor and running from his own shadow, sat handcuffed across from the lead detectives. The investigators did not need to shout or employ aggressive tactics. They simply laid out the irrefutable evidence of the genetic profile match on the metal table before him. Faced with the absolute certainty of modern biological science, the psychological fortress Liu had built around his horrific secret instantly crumbled. He lowered his head, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and began to detail the monstrous crime he had committed 21 years prior. To understand the anatomy of this tragedy, investigators had to delve into the psychological background of the killer. Liu Shenzhang was born in 1974, a native of the agricultural Maqiao Village located in the Dancheng County of Xiao Guo City. His parents were ordinary, incredibly poor farmers who toiled endlessly in the fields to provide for their family. His older brother followed in their footsteps, taking up agricultural work to help support the household. Despite their severe financial destitution, Liu's parents doted on their youngest son, shielding him from the harshest realities of their poverty and attempting to provide him with whatever meager comforts they could afford. However, this misguided affection bred a deep sense of entitlement rather than gratitude. Liu dropped out of school immediately after completing his elementary education. While he initially helped his mother with simple chores around the house, he quickly grew abhorrent of any form of hard work. The humiliating contrast between his own impoverished reality and the seemingly easier lives of his peers fostered a toxic, simmering resentment within him. As he grew into a teenager, his personality darkened. He became gluttonous, intensely lazy, and began associating with a violent crowd of local delinquents. During one particularly brutal altercation, Liu and his gang severely beat a young man, sending him to the hospital with extensive injuries. The financial burden of this crime fell entirely upon Liu's aging parents, who were forced to labor relentlessly for 6 agonizing months just to pay off the victim's medical bills. Shockingly, Liu felt absolutely no remorse for the crushing debt he had forced upon his family. Instead, his twisted psychology led him to blame the universe, feeling uniquely cursed and violently angry that he had been born into a family with low socioeconomic status. After a brief, failed stint working in a nearby town, he retreated to his parents' home, comfortably settling back into a parasitic lifestyle. By the winter of 1996, the 22-year-old Liu Shenzhang could no longer avoid the responsibilities of adulthood. An acquaintance told him about the lucrative, albeit grueling, opportunities in the coal mines of Shenmi City. The recruiter painted a picture of quick wealth, promising that just a few years of hard labor in the dark shafts would provide enough money to marry, build a house, and secure a comfortable future. Enticed by the prospect of financial independence, Liu agreed to make the journey. He arrived at the private coal mine in Maqiao Village on November 24th. The reality of the labor, however, was a shocking contrast to his fantasies. The work was physically devastating, requiring hours of back-breaking exertion deep within the suffocating, dust-filled earth. By his second day, his inherent laziness and deep-seated resentment flared with a vengeance. He despised the dirt, the exhaustion, and the grueling monotony. Seeking an escape from his miserable reality, Liu wandered into a local village tavern on the afternoon of November 26th. He ordered a cheap meal and a bottle of strong liquor, drinking heavily and entirely alone as his anger fermented. Recognizing that the young laborer was becoming heavily intoxicated and dangerously belligerent, the tavern owner eventually cut him off, firmly advising him to return to his quarters and sleep it off. Stumbling out into the crisp autumn air, Liu decided to take the isolated shortcut back to the mining camp. This path led him directly up the steep, overgrown slope toward the abandoned coal shafts. As the drunken, furious, and sexually frustrated young man staggered up the dirt path, he spotted a small figure walking alone. It was 8-year-old Xiao Guo, happily munching on a packet of dry instant noodles as she made her way home from school. In that fleeting, fatal moment, Liu's simmering rage and twisted desires coalesced into a predatory impulse. He glanced around the desolate landscape, confirming there were no witnesses. Operating with the cowardly stealth of a predator, he crept up behind the unsuspecting child as she paused beneath a barren tree. Without warning, Liu clamped his large, filthy hand tightly over the little girl's mouth and nose. The sheer terror of the ambush caused Xiao Guo to drop her beloved snack onto the dirt path. She fought back with every ounce of strength her tiny body possessed, scratching desperately at his thick forearms, but her efforts were futile against the grown man. Liu overpowered her instantly, dragging her thrashing body up the slope and hurling her into the suffocating darkness of the abandoned cave. When she hit the hard, rocky floor, the terrified child burst into tears. Operating purely on a desperate survival instinct, she grabbed her small leather backpack and held it up like a shield. a heartbreaking attempt to fend off the monster towering over her. Liu coldly snatched the backpack from her trembling hands and tossed it deep into the shadows. He violently pinned her to the earth. Ignoring her agonizing screams and desperate pleas for mercy, he proceeded to brutally assault her. As the assault continued, Liu realized the child's cries were echoing dangerously out toward the pathway. Driven by a cold, calculated need for self-preservation, he wrapped his heavy hands around her fragile throat, simultaneously covering her mouth to muffle the sounds of her agony. He maintained this lethal pressure until her struggles ceased entirely and her tiny body went completely limp. When he finally released his grip, he realized the 8-year-old girl was dead. Sitting in the interrogation room 21 years later, Liu confessed that he felt absolutely no pang of guilt as he looked down at her lifeless body. His only concern was concealing his horrific crime. He located a rusted shovel left behind in the cave and frantically shoveled loose dirt and rocks over her battered form, burying the evidence of his depravity. He then stood up, brushed the soil from his clothes, and walked back to the mining camp as if nothing had happened. That very evening, as the frantic cries of the search party echoed through the village, the sociopathic killer joined the crowd. He feigned innocent concern, actively asking his co-workers about the missing girl, and even eagerly offering useless information to the investigating officers to deflect any potential suspicion. He maintained this chilling charade, working at the Maqiao mine for another 2 months, before quietly resigning and vanishing into the vast expanse of the country. For the next 2 decades, Liu lived the life of a frightened nomad. While he never felt true remorse for the innocent life he extinguished, he was eternally haunted by the fear of capture. Whenever a news broadcast or a television program mentioned child abduction or forensic advancements, panic would seize him. He would immediately abandon his job, pack his meager belongings, and flee to a new, remote province, constantly trying to outrun the shadow of the murdered girl. Following his full confession, the judicial system faced a massive legal hurdle. The timeline of the case presented a severe complication under the laws of the country. Article 87 of the Criminal Law of the People's Republic of China explicitly dictates the statute of limitations for criminal prosecution. For the most severe offenses, where the maximum statutory penalty is life imprisonment or death, the absolute time limit for prosecution is strictly capped at 20 years. Because Xiao Guo was murdered in late 1996 and Liu Shenzhang was not apprehended until early 2017, the case had technically surpassed the legal threshold by several months. However, the law contains a vital contingency for cases of extraordinary severity. Recognizing that a monstrous predator had violently raped and murdered an 8-year-old child, the Xinjiang City People's Procuratorate refused to let a technicality grant him freedom. On April 10, 2017, they officially compiled the horrific details of the case and submitted a formal petition to the Supreme People's Procuratorate, the highest national agency responsible for legal prosecution. They argued that the sheer brutality of the crime, the victim's extreme vulnerability, and the devastating social impact the murder had inflicted upon the community necessitated an exception. After a thorough review, the Supreme People's Procuratorate agreed. They ruled that despite the expiration of the 20-year statute, the severe nature and catastrophic consequences of the offense demanded that the killer be held fully accountable. They officially approved the prosecution, paving the way for the trial. With the legal barriers shattered, the Zhang family finally saw the man who destroyed their lives brought into a court of law. On March 24, 2018, the Xinjiang City People's Court formally heard the case. During the extensive trial proceedings, the court meticulously reviewed the overwhelming biological evidence, the suspect's corroborated confession, and the arguments presented by the prosecution. The judge delivered a crushing, uncompromising verdict. Liu Shenzhang was found guilty of rape and intentional homicide. In accordance with the law, Liu was initially handed a death sentence with a 2-year reprieve, a specific judicial ruling where the execution is suspended, but almost always results in permanent incarceration or eventual execution depending on subsequent reviews. Furthermore, he was permanently stripped of all political rights for the remainder of his life. In the accompanying civil lawsuit, the court ordered Liu to pay the grieving Zhang family a total of 42,000 yuan, a sum equivalent to roughly $6,500, as compensation for their decades of economic and emotional suffering. Following the initial ruling, the Changzhou Intermediate People's Court reviewed the proceedings. They emphasized that Liu had raped and murdered a victim well under the age of 14, an act that had terrorized the local community and caused immeasurable psychological damage to the regional student population. Acknowledging that the prosecution period had expired, but noting his full confession upon capture, they upheld the severity of the punishment. Liu Shenzhang stood before the judge, quietly expressed his acceptance of the ruling, and formally declined his right to file an appeal. After the expiration of the mandatory appeal period, the case files were transferred to the Henan Provincial High People's Court for ultimate ratification. The High Court reviewed the horrific facts and delivered the absolute final judgment. The suspension was lifted. The final, inescapable sentence for Liu Shenzhang was death. After 21 years of agonizing uncertainty, the nightmare had finally reached its conclusion. The capture and conviction of the fugitive killer brought a profound sense of closure to a deeply traumatized community. While absolutely nothing could ever erase the decades of unimaginable pain and suffering endured by the Zhang family as they waited in the dark, the undeniable victory of justice offered a small measure of peace. This case stands as a monumental testament to the power of modern investigative technology. Without the preservation of that microscopic genetic sample and the relentless advancement of biological profiling, this horrific crime would have remained forever buried in the dusty archives, and a predator would have escaped into history. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most chilling and complex cold cases in criminal history. The incredible power of forensic science to reach across decades and pull a killer out from the shadows is truly remarkable. Do you think the statute of limitations should ever apply to violent crimes against children? Or should there always be an exception for murder? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you appreciate these deep investigative breakdowns, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next case.